Well, good morning or good afternoon, depending from which part of the world you are watching us. And thank you very, very much for joining us in the presentation of this research on transitional justice and prevention. Excuse me. The reports we are launching today are already available in our website, ICTJ.org, and we encourage you to download them and read them in detail after what we hope it will be, and I'm sure it will be, an interesting conversation we are going to have today. We have put together what we think is a very interesting program with great speakers to whom we are very grateful for their participation and for sharing with us their knowledge, their insights, and their expertise. I will encourage everyone to also participate with your own questions during the webinar and during the different panels. We don't have a lot of time, so we will start with our agenda from now. I want to welcome Mr. Franz Fayot, the Minister of the Economy and Minister for Development, Cooperation and Humanitarian Affairs of Luxembourg, who has sent us his opening remarks to open the event today. If my colleagues can help me, we will listen to his intervention.
Dear Mr. Travessi, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to be speaking to you at this important event for the launch of ICTJ's research reports on transitional justice and prevention. As many of you know, prevention has long been part of the global policy agenda. But very importantly, it has been prioritized by actors such as the UN and the EU in recent years and been integrated into key policies like Agenda 2030 and the SDGs. This global policy agenda recognizes the relevance of transitional justice for peace and stability. Prevention is the first imperative of justice. The UN stated early on, and we strongly agree with this statement. We believe that transitional justice is a significant component to prevent further conflict by addressing the full spectrum of human rights violations. Putting prevention at the forefront of the global policy agenda makes ICTJ's research presented today especially valuable and timely. Luxembourg is therefore pleased to have supported its trusted and long-standing partner, ICTJ, in this important endeavor. We share your goal of justice and peace, and we truly value your role as a thought leader in the field of transitional justice. Luxembourg is proud of how our partnership has developed since 2005. In line with our joint priorities, our collaboration has grown to include support for transitional justice processes in Tunisia since 2012 and in Colombia since 2016. Most recently, it has encompassed support for your important work on the preventative capacity of transitional justice. With Luxembourg's support, ICTJ has contested calls to end Tunisia's transitional justice process, fostered broader societal understanding and support of the process, as well as raised awareness of challenges faced by victims in their pursuit of justice. In Colombia, ICTJ has implemented transitional justice in a way that advances accountability and fulfillment of victims' rights. Our support has also strengthened ICTJ's ability to withstand profound geopolitical and economic shifts of the last decade and to adapt to challenges posed by the global health crisis. With this event, which marks another important step in our partnership, Luxembourg aims to help promote the integration of transitional justice in national, regional, and international policies and programs on prevention. Today, more than ever, we need to show strong political will and leadership at the highest level. And you can count on Luxembourg's continued support to advance this important agenda worldwide. In that regard, I wish you all very fruitful discussions today, lots of perseverance in carrying out your important mission. Finally, I look forward to meeting you, Mr. Travesi, in New York next month and to hearing your thoughts on the outcome of this timely event. Thank you.
Thank you to Minister Fayot, and thank you to the Ministry of Foreign and European Affairs of Luxembourg. Thank you also to Ambassador Christian Brown, the permanent representative of Luxembourg to the United Nations, who will join us later in the event. And thank you everyone for their participation, support, and partnership. We are extremely glad to launch today the publication of our cutting-edge research in partnership with the government of Luxembourg, who, as we've heard, is a long-term strategic ally to ICTJ in our mission to challenge the causes and address the consequences of massive human rights violations, and a staunch supporter of peace building and conflict prevention as member of the European Union and the United Nations. So thank you very much. As Minister Fayot emphasized in his remarks, prevention is an important element of the global policy agenda. And ICTJ has made it an institutional strategic priority of its own, along with the 2030 Agenda of Sustainable Development, for already a few years. With this research project and events such as this one, which will be the first in a series, our aim is to advance the policy discussion on the role of transitional justice in preventing the recurrence, not only of human rights violations and atrocities, but also of violence, conflict, and injustices more broadly. Today, we have invited experts from the peace building and conflict prevention communities to join us to launch the research, and we hope a long-term policy conversation. With us are experts from key regions and the European Union and the Africa Union, who both play a prominent role in the fields of peace building, conflict prevention, and transitional justice. The European Union was the first organization to adopt a regional policy on transitional justice in 2015, and the African Union more recently in 2019. We welcome the strong collaboration these two organizations are building to develop their policies, and we stand ready to support them in fulfilling their potential as key supporters of transitional justice in the African continent and beyond. We are also joined by civil society experts and activists who have played a critical role in the transitional justice processes in their own countries that are different from the case studies looked at in our research. And we want to hear their reflections on how transitional justice has contributed and is still contributing to sustainable and durable peace. We want to highlight the vital role these actors play and the need for the international community to support them. The publications that, as I said, are available in our website that we are launching today include case studies on Colombia, Morocco, Peru, the Philippines, and Sierra Leone. And we are very grateful to have the chance to hear from two of the researchers themselves on the experiences of Sierra Leone and Colombia. The countries we looked at represent very different contexts, including those emerging from violent conflict, those where repressive governments have committed gross violations in the past, and those where violence and repression persist. From this range of context, we have identified broadly applicable findings on the importance of addressing the causes and consequences of injustice. Building a more peaceful, inclusive, and just society is the long-term goal of all development and peace-building policies and programs. Our research and experience help us to make the case for integrating transitional justice into these policies, and to do that in a substantive and coherent manner. And we are very glad to work alongside like-minded governments, like the government of Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Sweden, and institutions like the African Union, the European Union, or the United Nations, and of course, victims groups and civil society organizations towards this shared objective. Without further ado, I want to hand over the screen to my colleague, Roger Beauty, who is the senior research expert on ICTJ, who has been leading this tremendous effort of research case studies to introduce the researchers into our country cases. Roger, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Fernando, and thank you to all the speakers and to everyone who's joining the event today. As Fernando said, this research project included 5 country case studies, and I'm very pleased to be joined for this part of the discussion by the authors of the studies on Sierra Leone and Colombia. Ibrahim Bangura is a lecturer at the University of Sierra Leone, a senior partner at Transition International, and has worked extensively on issues of transitional justice, security sector reform, and conflict resolution. Maria Cielo Linares is a researcher with ICTJ, supporting the organization's work with the Colombian Truth Commission, and has previously worked, among other places, at the Colombian Commission of Jurists. Before turning to Ibrahim and Cielo, I just wanted to take a few minutes and highlight some of the project's main findings very briefly. As Fernando said, while prevention has always been integral to our understanding of transitional justice, including through the notion of guarantees of non-recurrence, the focus in the field has mainly been on preventing serious and massive human rights violations. And one of the objectives of research like this is to help to broaden the discussion to include the prevention of violence and violent conflict more generally. Previous work on the issue done by others has shown that there are good reasons to think that transitional justice can contribute to prevention in this broad sense. And what we wanted to do was to complement this with a series of in-depth case studies that are useful tools in exploring some of the specific ways in which that contribution can happen. The findings suggest that one of the main ways in which transitional justice can make such a contribution is by addressing common drivers and causes. Human rights violations often happen alongside and share common drivers with violence and violent conflict. One of those drivers, which is emphasized quite a bit in the policy discourse on prevention, is exclusion and the grievances associated with exclusion. These things can be a factor in the onset of both violence and abuse. They can be reinforced by violence and abuse, and they can in turn be used to mobilize and instrumentalize further violence and abuse. And our case studies suggest that transitional justice can help to counter this dynamic by fostering, by addressing those grievances and fostering inclusion in different ways. At the individual level, by providing support and recognition, by facilitating participation, by increasing people's awareness of their rights. At the collective level, by drawing attention to and examining and even prioritizing the regions or communities or groups that may have been targeted by violations or by structural marginalization more broadly. And at both levels, by making people feel that they are more equally protected by the rule of law, both as individuals and members of groups. Another common driver that I wanted to highlight was the compromised, corrupt, and fragile nature of the institutions and the networks that perpetrate or allow for violence and abuse, or that are integral to the exclusion and marginalization that reinforces that abuse. The persistence of these types of institutions, we know, can lead to the continuation or the transformation of different types of violence during and long after immediate transitional periods. Again, the findings suggest that transitional justice may be able to help counter this dynamic. by helping to establish or reform a whole range of institutions, including security institutions, including those that can play sometimes a direct role in conflict and violence prevention, but also things like constitutional and legal frameworks, and anti-corruption bodies and education and other social institutions, which tend to play a more indirect and long-term role in prevention. These are things that are all very often recommended by truth commissions, and importantly, the case studies show that they can happen at both the national and the more local levels. I also just wanted to highlight that the case studies show that there are certain limitations, certain common limitations on the preventive impact of transitional justice. These include real tensions that exist, particularly in the short term between justice measures and stability. Justice processes that may be seen in themselves to be insufficiently participatory or even exclusionary. A very, very common lack of implementation of reforms that are promised or measures that are recommended by truth commissions. And then a series of contextual factors like ongoing conflict or limited political transition, or counterterrorism agendas, or a general kind of lack of broader transformational change within a society. These are all things that can, in different ways, undermine the preventive impact of transitional justice. Overall, I would say that using a broad prevention lens to look at transitional justice doesn't really require us to fundamentally rethink how we understand transitional justice, but I think it does emphasize the importance of certain things and certain objectives, like the importance of addressing not just the consequences, but the causes of injustice, and the importance of pursuing objectives like inclusion, long-term reform, long-term and broad reform, and establishing coherence with other policies of prevention and peace building. All of the countries that we looked at for this project are still contending in many ways with some of the causes of their violence and violent conflict and abuse. But at the same time, they've also made important progress in prevention and reduction. And so I think while we don't want to expect that transitional justice processes on their own can lead to prevention, the case studies do suggest that they can make an important contribution. So with that, I'd like to turn to Ibrahim and Cielo to discuss the specific experiences of two countries, both of which have implemented a range of transitional justice processes, and both of which were done in the context of violent conflict, but at the same time in quite different situations. Ibrahim, if I can start with you. Sierra Leone implemented a number of transitional justice processes in the aftermath of its armed conflict. Can you possibly discuss a couple of specific examples of the ways in which transitional justice may have contributed to prevention in the broad sense, as well as some of the factors, the types of factors that may have limited that preventive impact?
Thank you very much, Roger. I'm very sorry that I cannot show the video. I'm in myself on video. There's a storm here at the moment, and the connection is quite bad, but I'll be showing my face quite soon. There are many ways that transitional justice contributed to prevention. Just highlighting a few because of the time we have. It promoted accountability for atrocities, especially when you look at the activities of the Special Court for Sierra Leone and the indictment of very senior and very powerful people, including Charles Taylor, who was a sitting president in Liberia. This sent a message that no one is above the law, and if you commit atrocities, you will be brought to account at some point. And also, let me point at the fact that it promoted institutional reforms, with massive investments made in reforming the security and justice sectors in Sierra Leone, which helped to strengthen rule of law, human rights, and issues related to social justice and accountability. For instance, there were several institutions established, such as the Human Rights Commission of Sierra Leone, the Anti-Corruption Commission, the Legal Aid Board. A new Ministry of Defense was established. The Sierra Leone police was reformed very extensively. We also helped to establish, through transitional justice mechanisms and support, decentralized security structures, such as the Provisional Security Committee, which is called the PROSEC, the District Security Committee, the DISEC, the Chiefdom Security Committees, and very importantly, through efforts that are related to transitional justice, the local needs policing process was initiated, which helped to also establish models such as the local police partnership boards, which is a model that has been tested in places like Sudan. Through the LPPBs, people became quite aware of how security measures are undertaken, and also to bridge the gulf that was existing between security sector actors and local community members. Going to your question on what has limited the preventive impact, I'll point at probably three key factors because of time. One is the lack of implementation of the TRC recommendations. The recommendations were quite extensive, well done, well researched, spoke very extensively to the challenges that Sierra Leone was contending with, but there was a significant lack of political will at the end of the day to look at them and then adapt them to the context that was existing, and also to invest in ensuring that the historical legacies of the conflict were addressed. There were also several laws passed, very good legislations, policies, but these policies were not enforced. These laws were not enforced, and they had to do with issues related to social justice, human rights, and the welfare of Sierra Leoneans. Thirdly, I'll look at the lack of funding and the high dependence on donors to fund issues related to the rule of law, human rights, etc. When, for instance, the British stopped their funding to Sierra Leone, direct budgetary support to security and justice sector institutions, then most of the gains that we made started to erode, because the government relied very heavily on donors, and there was also budgetary constraints, which has over the years undermined some of the gains Sierra Leone succeeded in making from between 2002 to 2016. Yes, Roger.
Great. Thank you so much for covering really a wide range of issues in a very short intervention. I have a follow-up question, which is, the armed conflict in Sierra Leone ended almost 2 decades ago. If you can sort of step back a little bit and think about, given where the country is today, how can the country build on the contribution that transitional justice made to prevention, to move forward and address some of the challenges that it still faces today, and some of the underlying causes from the conflict which still may exist?
I'll answer it from 2 perspectives. One, I'll say, unfortunately, most of the challenges that we are contending with in Peru, Sierra Leone, continue to exist. When you look at issues related to the marginalization of women and youth, poverty and economic hardship, especially among young people and women, the question of illiteracy, unemployment, regionalization of politics, endemic corruption, they continue to persist. So to hit on the question you asked, I think what we have to do as a nation is, in order to enhance the gains that have been made, the government and its development partners must shift their approach. They need to recognize that the root causes and historical legacies of the war remain largely unaddressed. And also, a more comprehensive approach to sustaining peace and development should be adopted. Revisiting the TRC recommendations and adapting them to meet the country's current challenges, and at the same time addressing the historical legacies of the conflict. This will require enormous political will and resources, something that has been undermined, involving grassroots and community-based approaches to transitional justice, to help heal a deeply traumatized and poverty-stricken country. So there's a lot of responsibility on the part of governments and the development partners to ensure that we go back, look at the TRC recommendations, look at the gaps that exist, try to contextualize them and adapt them to the challenges we face today, and then use a very holistic, horizontally integrated approach to ensure that all the different stakeholders are on board in order for us to properly and adequately address the continuing challenges. Roger.
Great, thank you so much, Ibrahim. Cielo, your study focused on the transitional justice measures that Colombia implemented in the 10 years or so before the 2016 peace agreement, when the main armed conflict was very much still ongoing. Can you also discuss briefly a couple of examples of ways in which transitional justice processes during that time may have contributed positively to prevention, as well as some of the factors that may have limited its preventive impact?
Yes, thank you, Roger. Thank you, ICTJ and Luxembourg for this meeting. And I want to especially thank, of course, the ICTJ Colombian office for letting me follow this research. So yeah, Roger, the research is focused on the Justice and Peace Law of 2005 and the Victims Law of 2011. It doesn't cover the Justice and Peace, the Peace Agreement, sorry. So regarding some specific examples of contribution seen in the research. The first one is that they created spaces for victims' participation, especially the Victims Law. This was especially made through the victims' participation in the discussion, application, and follow-up of public policies targeting victims, mostly made through the Victims Table and the Transitional Justice Committees. This law also, when specifically the Victims Law, created the Unified Victims Registry that unified the others registry done beforehand, and it's used for public policies. And also it created the land dispossession process that, by lightening the burden of proof, opened the door for victims to recover their land. And also indirectly, this transitional justice mechanism opened the space for the creation of many victims organizations, such as, for example, the movement of victims of state created while the Justice and Peace Law was being discussed in Congress. This transitional justice mechanism also added issues to the agenda, especially the social and political agenda. Some examples are the existence of economic and political networks supporting the conflict, also the need to address the plundering of land, and also the necessity of a comprehensive reparation. And finally, they also contributed to the development of a culture of awareness and respect for human rights. The best example, not the only one, but the best one, is how the discourse about the paramilitary violence changed after the Justice and Peace process. But of course, as you mentioned, and also Ibrahim mentioned, there were some challenges. The first one is the ongoing violence. In the implementation of both transitional justice mechanisms, there were at least 5 internal armed conflicts. There were also, these mechanisms were too complex and ambitious, especially the Victims Law. This law was more focused on the ought to be rather than what was feasible, and it did not foresee the material and formal barriers that could occur. These generate minimal compliance of its measures and undermines the state confidence. For example, one can see little progress in addressing gender and ethnic discrimination, even though the Victims Law had many measures about those issues. In some cases, they were completely ignored, and on others, when they were taken into account, this was made through a colonialist or a macho lens. There were also some other little impacts on structural issues of violence. For example, one can see little tools to prosecute the power behind the power and corruption, and also little progress in addressing economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights violations. These two challenges can explain the resurgence of violence in many regions nowadays. For example, Montes de Maria, that was one of the regions investigated in this research. And also one can see a lack of coordination between national, local, and local levels, and between the same transitional justice mechanism. And very connected to this one can see fickle political will, especially in two aspects. The first one is providing an effective response against spoilers. And the second one is one can see contradictory positions between political entities, especially regarding the restitution of dispossessed land. And finally, there is a narrow view of prevention implemented, especially by the victims law, because the Justice and Peace law said nothing on prevention. The victims unit, rather than using a broad interpretation of prevention, understand prevention as crisis prevention.
Thank you so much again for covering such a wide, so much ground in a quick intervention. Colombia's peace agreement relative to Sierra Leone is obviously fairly recent, but I wonder if I could ask the same question that I asked Ibrahim, if you can step back and reflect on where the country stands today, given the peace agreement and the comprehensive transitional justice system, and think about some of the ways in which the country can build on the contribution the contributions that you mentioned to deal with some of the underlying drivers and causes of the violence that still exist.
Yes, Roger, actually the first lesson learned from these experiences is the need to focus on structural issues of violence, such as a state that is more concerned about protecting the specific interests of the elite rather than guaranteeing the rights of its citizens, the systemic state corruption, and also the deep inequality and the classist worldview in Colombia that rejects those who are different by gender, ethnicity, sex, wealth, ideology, education, and so on, among other structural issues. And the second lesson learned is the need to improve the level of coordination between transitional justice mechanisms, but also between them and other policies. And the components created by the peace agreement that are being implemented nowadays show the repetition of some coordination problems seen in the research regarding objectives, strategies, and actions. The third lesson is to start having difficult discussions regarding the structure that maintain violence and the power behind the power. So to summarize and not to take more time of this event, there is a need to continue the work regarding the development of a culture of awareness and respect for human rights, and broaden it to include economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. This means first to criminally investigate their violations, secondly to include them in the truth and memory initiatives, and finally to start linking transitional justice and sustainable development, especially regarding reparation and the guarantees of non-recurrence. The Havana Peace Agreement sets out a pathway to begin these necessary changes, especially, sadly, in the components with less implementation. So one of the most important focus nowadays is to move forward with their implementation.
Thanks so much, Cielo, and really thanks to both of you for your great insights and really giving us some specific examples to consider and covering a range of issues like rule of law and institutional reform and participation and economic and social issues and root causes and the importance of addressing all these issues from a preventive standpoint and the challenges faced in Colombia and Sierra Leone. With that, I'd like to turn the floor over to Melanie Greenberg, who is going to moderate a discussion with 4 expert commentators on the research and some of the issues that it raises. Melanie is the Managing Director of Peacebuilding at Humanity United. She previously was the President and CEO of the Alliance for Peacebuilding. She's an expert on international law and security and peacebuilding. And we're extremely grateful to have her here today to offer insights. Thank you, Melanie. I give the floor to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Roger. Thanks to ICTJ, the government of Luxembourg, to all of our speakers today, and just my deep appreciation for the researchers who have made this report possible. As Roger mentioned, I've spent my career in peacebuilding, but initially trained as an international lawyer. And I've always been frustrated at the division between peacebuilding and the human rights community. And what is so exciting about transitional justice generally, but this report in particular, is the ability to use transitional justice as a key element of peacebuilding. And this report has broadened the definition of prevention to truly create a bridge between peacebuilding and transitional justice. As I saw in the report, the emphasis on issues of inclusion, on issues of addressing corrupt institutions, of sequencing issues of security and justice, and especially on making transitional justice not a sterile set of international legal procedures, but a true forum where civil society and government can come together and really point the way for a more integrated justice and peace-building community that's very much in line with the goals of SDG 16 and other ways of thinking in a more integrated way about peace-building. So it's a great pleasure to be here with our participants and panelists, and I'm just thrilled to introduce to you the people with whom we'll be talking for the next 40 minutes or so. And we have a wonderful range of policymakers, civil society activists, and everyone with deep expertise in transitional justice across a range of contexts. We have with us today in this panel, Ambassador Frederick Gateretse Ngoga from Burundi. He is the head of the Conflict Prevention and Early Warning Division at the African Union and former senior officer of the African Union Mission in Somalia. We also have René Van Ness. He's the head of division for the Conflict Prevention and Mediation Support Division at the European External Action Services, and a former special envoy for the World Humanitarian Summit, representing the Dutch Minister of Foreign Affairs. And he's a former head of the political and economic sessions in the EU delegation in Tanzania and Ethiopia. We have Tabu Sarr from the Gambia, who is head of the Civil Society Gender Platform on Transitional Justice and Chief Reconciliation Officer of the Truth, Reconciliation, Reparations Commission, and President of the Network of Women, Peace and Security in the ECOWAS region. And finally, we have Patricia Neundi from Kenya, the former CEO of Kenya's Truth, Justice and Reconciliation Commission, the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and the Federation of Women Lawyers, and she's currently the Nairobi Director at Crisis Action. So welcome everyone. It's just wonderful to be in conversation with you today. And starting today with you, Ambassador Ngoga, just to ask a question, how does transitional justice fit into the AU's perception of prevention and peace building?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, and it's good to see René and other colleagues, and I would like to thank you for the invitation. I was listening in very carefully when they were talking. I think this is a critical element of conflict prevention. Often when we think about conflict prevention, we often think about countries which have not gone into conflict, but we neglect those that have been in conflict and they remain at risk of getting back into conflict. I can tell you that most of the countries that have been in conflict remain, at least for the next 10 to 20 years, still vulnerable to get back into conflict, particularly because the issues of justice have never been dealt with properly. The truth is often selective depending on who won the war or who had the upper hand. And the issue of reparation is talked about in name, but it's never implemented. And I think that the other element that is quite important that people tend to forget also is about a conversation that needs to be held within the country about where, as nations, they want to go in the future. Today, as I'm speaking with you, I've been following in my own country, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has been doing some work about some of the crimes that were committed in our country's history. But the way they are going about it is actually creating friction. Now, people are not against the truth, but people are against what truth you choose to put first. And for example, they have adopted a methodology where they say, oh, you know what, we're going to go with the big massacres that have happened. That's fine, all well and good. But then the people are saying, even if you go with the big massacres that have happened, you need to also at the same time communicate about the smaller massacres, so that because these are countries where everybody has been a victim. Communication is extremely important. I think Ibrahim Mangoura said something which also was important, which is when we have recommendations, often the challenges that we have, actually peace agreements often come with also things to implement and recommendation. The challenge that we often have is the lack of resources, which is not of the government's doing, or which is not of anyone's doing, quite frankly, makes people very suspicious about the intentions. People think that there are games that are being played, and often, people continue to look at each other with suspicion. So the healing part doesn't come into play. So you cannot have a country that has been in conflict, that has all these justice issues, not addressed, and then not think that at some point, whether there is an election, whether there is an issue that touches at the core of who the society is, that you're constantly vulnerable to going back to civil conflict. Again, I've seen this in the Central African Republic, where we were working to secure a peace agreement. The number one thing that everybody kept talking about, they said, you know what, reconciliation fine, but justice first. But justice also comes with a challenge. It comes with a challenge because, unfortunately, those that make peace are those who are fighting each other. And those that were fighting each other find themselves in government. So it becomes very difficult to, culprits cannot judge themselves. And it creates really a challenge going forward. So, but justice, if you look at all the countries that have gone through conflict and that have emerged from it, you will still find that justice is still wanting. The judiciary system remains wedded so much to the executive that, you don't really have independence of justice. So this is some of the key points I wanted to highlight, but I wanted to say something regarding mental health. I think if there is one thing that is often neglected in the process of transitional justice, it's the impact that a conflict has on its people. Just because people are not throwing tantrums and are not throwing chairs doesn't mean that they're okay. I think that we've never appreciated the impact on the mental health of people who have been in conflict for so many years, who have seen crimes that are indescribable and what it does to them. And their conflict in general, small conflict. I can tell you, if you look at the countries that have been in civil conflict, any dispute easily turns into a gun battle. Any dispute turns into violence. So I think the mental health aspect of things also needs to be factored in, how people were affected, what it has done to them, and also how the government can help them, accompany them in the way they live their lives. I've seen in Rwanda where they have done, they have acknowledged such a thing, and they are really working on it. But all in all, it's still a traumatized society because of what happened. And I think that all our societies remain traumatized. You cannot go through war and think that everything is okay. It stays with you for quite some time, but it's work that needs to be undertaken. And hopefully, if you have lost one generation, you work so that the other generation, you do not bequeath them with the burdens that you have inherited. I thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And I'm very grateful to you for mentioning the issue of trauma. So I think that mirrors the understanding that we're now realizing in the peacebuilding field, that if you've looked at peacebuilding circa 2011, there was a feeling that if you get the institutions right, everything will follow. and that the pendulum has really swung to realize that unless you address trauma, almost nothing else can happen, because people who are traumatized will lash out in violence or will withdraw. There's so many ways that that manifests. And as you talk about the generational change, we now know that trauma is actually passed epigenetically from generation to generation. So it's something I think we can all reflect on as moving forward. But I would like to ask you one quick follow-up question is, as you read the research findings from the ICTJ reports on everything from individual engagement with processes to the more policy level, what do some of these findings say, or how do they resonate with the AU prevention policy? How are you drawing those links between what you're seeing in this report and the policy that you're creating?
I think there was one thing that really struck me. It was the need for a constant dialogue between civil society and the governments. If there is one thing that I've seen that is missing, and where I think we can play the middleman, is to really have a conversation between governments and those who are governed and their governments. I don't think that there is a single person in this world who wakes up in the morning and says, you know what, I'm going to burn my country. I don't think there is any government official, but there is people who actually want to do good, but who think that they understand what their populations are going through, and who have absolutely no clue what the priorities of their populations are. So what we have been trying to do at the AU, for example, we have developed what we call the Continental Structural Conflict Prevention Framework. It's a long name. The Continental Structural Conflict Prevention Framework. It has two pillars. The first pillar is the country structural vulnerability assessment, whereby we work with the governments to identify their structural vulnerabilities, including these areas of justice, the environment, human development, and so on and so forth. And by the way, when they are assessing themselves about their structural vulnerabilities, they do consultations within the country, and they make sure that the population can really express themselves about how they feel about issues. Then we have what we call the country structural mitigation strategy. Once you have developed once you have done the assessment, now you have to work on mitigating some of these challenges. And I can tell you one key pillar is justice. Justice keeps coming up on and on and on and on and on again. I think it's Maria who was mentioning about land issues. If you were to look at there are 5 key natural resources which causes conflict on the African continent, at least as far as we're concerned. And in this order, 1 is land. Land is the number 1 source of conflict on our continent. 2 is oil. Oil is also a source of conflict. Now, you would think that these are blessings, but they are curses, actually, in most cases, if they're not managed well. 3, it is water. Water is a major source of conflict, and soon enough, we'll have actually more conflicts over water than anything else. 4 is minerals. And then 5 is fisheries. And I'll tell you this, show me a conflict on the continent, and I'll show you a natural resource in dispute. So I will leave it at that.
Good. Thank you very much. And I'd like to encourage our audience, as you're watching, please make comments in the chat, ask questions. We'll have time for Q&A, but please don't hold back. Now, moving on to you, Mr. Van Ness. It's a pleasure to be talking with you today. And I'm wondering, as we've just heard about the AU's policy approach to prevention, transitional justice, whether you see within the EU, whether transitional justice is an element of your approach to conflict prevention, and also how you see this engagement between government and civil society as you're thinking about your policies.
Yeah, thanks, Melanie, and dear organizers. It's great to have the opportunity to join you today. Congratulations on the important research finding, really insightful and relevant for also for us in the European Union. Let me say first that I have certainly colleagues that know more about transitional justice than I do, but I was asked to share a few observations from a conflict prevention angle, and that is what I will do with you today. I was actually reflecting on what Melanie and Fred said, and it led me to the following observation. human rights violations are often a sign of weak governments, of a lack of democracy, of dysfunctional institutions, a lack of transparency, a lack of inclusivity. So human rights violations can only be dealt with if you address those issues. And of course, that is not a technical or a legal process, but that requires a highly political engagement. And that is indeed at the heart of conflict prevention. So your question was, does the EU see transitional justice as an element of its approach to conflict prevention? So the answer can be a wholehearted yes, absolutely. It is an important element in our conflict prevention approach. So let me say a few words about policy, practice, and partnerships. Maybe to start with, I prepared myself, of course, a bit for this, and I was looking at the UN World Bank document, Pathways to Peace. You must have all read that a few years ago. And that document puts grievances clearly among the key root causes of conflict, of violent conflict. And without addressing those past grievances, peace is hardly ever able to be sustained. We see that every day. We see that in the Western Balkans. We see that in Armenia, Azerbaijan. We see that possibly in Cabo Delgado. Transitional justice is therefore crucial for conflicts prevention at large. And that's also what the EU said, indeed, already in 2015, an EU policy framework to support transitional justice. 2018, Council conclusions on the integrated approach to external conflicts and crises, which stress that promoting transitional justice is absolutely crucial in order to drive that integrated approach. It's not insignificant. The integrated approach basically tells us that we need to look at all the elements and bring all our tools together and work together with all the relevant partners, as we realize that no one can do it alone and not one single instrument can be successful just by itself. And indeed, I think your research findings suggest that as well. You presented it very modestly as a shortcoming. I don't think it is a shortcoming. You contribute to the overall thinking. Maybe a word about a line of work that's closer to my heart, and that's peace mediation. Last year, we developed a whole new policy foundation on this. We have a new EU concept on peace mediation, which was welcomed by Council conclusions. There, the EU really sets itself out as a principled and value-based actor with inclusion at the heart of it. And I was really struck by one of the earlier speakers that mentioned exclusion as one of the key elements to look at. And as we all know, if you want to make a change on inclusion, you need to make a radical commitment to do that, as the conflict parties are often exclusive by their very nature. So no shortage of policies and documents that support how important transitional justice is. But what are we doing in practice? Well, I will have to be short, and also here, I'm actually showing the feathers of others, and the others here are my colleagues in the European Commission. I will mention three very specific tools. The first one, some of you know very well because you're helping to implement it. It is the Transitional Justice Facility. There is a specific facility established in 2019 that is there only to provide short-term expertise on transitional justice. And I'm really happy that the ICTJ is a consortium member of that, together with a number of other absolutely brilliant organizations to take that work forward. Some of you that know as well know the European Instrument for Human Rights and Democracy. That is an instrument that is really at the heart of the EU's promotion of democracy and human rights, and it supports a lot of regional human rights organizations, fight against impunity, etc. Maybe an even bigger one is that increasingly we see that our development colleagues are taking transitional justice squarely in forward when they are programming their resources. I will just mention one for the Mindanao peace process. There is a big EU flagship program, 25 million euro, that has put transitional justice at the heart of it. So that was my second leg. The last one is short, it's partnerships. It's short because I'm running out of time, not because it's not important. The EU and the AU, we both have our dedicated policy, and that really helps for us to talk to each other. We talked about human rights in the Human Rights Dialogue in 2020, and indeed there we are talking as well with civil society, to come back to your question. And we are now preparing an expert seminar in the second half of this year with the African Union and civil society to have a much more detailed discussion. So I'm really looking forward at the next meeting with Fred and his team in the African Union, where we can discuss transitional justice from a conflict prevention lens. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your emphasis on exclusion and also for mentioning the links between transitional justice and development, which brought my mind back to the early days of conflict prevention doctrine, as it were, with the Carnegie Commission on Preventing Deadly Conflict, which talked about structural prevention and how to think about the role of development in all, Mr. Ambassador, the 5 resource areas that you talked about, and how those links between justice and development can be strengthened. So thank you so much. So it's a great pleasure now to turn the floor over to Ms. Saar. And I think it's really fortuitous that Mr. Van Ness had talked about issues of exclusion and inclusion, and wondered, as you're thinking about transitional processes in the Gambia, and especially the inclusion of women, how do you go about thinking about the links between inclusion and exclusion in transitional justice processes? I think that you might be on mute.
Thank you. Sorry about that. First of all, I would like to say thank you to ICTJ for giving me this opportunity to share our experiences as far as the Gambia is concerned in transitional justice processes. I would like to emphasize that from experience, when the TJ was introduced in the Gambia after the takeover to democracy from dictatorship, we realized that in the Gambia, there are some structural inequalities, and these are systems that are in place due to sociocultural norms and beliefs and practices. With the TJ program, we see that it's an opportunity. This is a system, or I could say a framework that allow inclusion as far as the Gambia is concerned. Because when the TJ was first introduced, we realized that it's an opportunity for women, especially, and young people and people living with disabilities, to at least have a voice in the processes. And as a result, a group was formed, which is this group that I represent, the CSO Gender Platform, with support from ICTJ, Gambia, and the UN, and other international partners. Seeing that the transitional justice allows each and everyone to participate, that is if the environment is enabling. And during the returning to democracy, we saw that we are a vulnerable group of people that has been marginalized for a long time, and this is an opportunity for us. So what we did was we came together and ensured that the process is influenced as far as gender mainstreaming is concerned. All right, the Gambia instituted 4 mechanisms of transitional justice. And this is the security sector reform, constitutional review commission, the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparation Commission, as far as, and also institutional and legal reforms. For TJ, We see it as a conflict prevention framework, simply because looking at the mechanisms that are put in place, when we realize that, for example, when we realized that it was a soul searching of what has transpired 22 years of leadership. And seeing that human rights violation was across the board, nobody was spared, women, children, young people, people living with disabilities. Having this commission in place has actually exposed and revealed and shared what has transpired for the past 22 years. Seeing that, we ensured that the composition of the commissioners were gender sensitive, and also gender issues were actually part of the discourse. In all the commissions, there are women affairs units, which deals with young people and children's issues. Now, the ambassador was talking about peace as an engine. With the TJ program in the Gambia, there was a research that was done, a conflict analysis research that was done, and it was found out that apart from the factors that the ambassador said, power was also can be part of it, because it was power that was used to abuse and violate human rights of Gambians by the former dictator. Now, the TJ program has given us the opportunity to compare and contrast systems under dictatorship and systems of democracy. And as a result, we have democracy, but also there are some challenges that we have encountered, simply because TJ programs are always very expensive, and coming from a developing country, the expectations are hardly met, simply because if you look at gender, it's a cross-cutting issue. It cuts across all the programs that we are set up, but still with, I'm sure, not intentional, there's still some structural issues that we deal with on a daily basis. And TJ programs do not actually factor that in. So this is a challenge that we have experienced. But also we have seen that it can prevent further or future human rights violations, because it raised the consciousness of everybody as far as human rights are concerned, because human rights in this part of the world is simply seen as a foreign concept. But with the Truth Commission, and people narrating their ordeals, it has actually showed that human rights is not foreign. It's actually something that we own as, because of we are human beings, and it's an entitlement, and people, no matter who you are, should be respected, and your rights should be protected, despite your condition, despite your status or your sex. So in a nutshell, this is what I would like to share, and to say that because of the TJ program, the Transitional Justice program, even though some of the mechanisms have failed, basically I could say they have failed, but we have managed to put in a bill through a private member to have our National Assembly increase for women only and people living with disabilities. And this is as a result of the TJ program. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that really wonderful overview and linking the issues of power and how power is analyzed and is addressed through transitional justice, but also the issue of narrative and storytelling and how people can be brought in and included through that storytelling, and how that can reduce marginalization. So thank you so much. Moving on now to Ms. Mayundi from Kenya, focusing in on one particular element of the ICJ reports, which are around the role of the rule of law and developing a culture of human rights in prevention. I wondered how the transitional justice processes in Kenya, such as the Truth Commission, made it less likely that political actors might use or stoke violence. And how did Kenya develop that culture? It'd be wonderful to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Melanie. And once again, thank you to ICTJ for the invitation and providing the platform. I think in a country where historically it's been possible to mobilize politically along ethnic lines, divisively, the truth process was extremely important for Kenya because one of the things I believe it has succeeded in doing is chipping away at the impunity. Hello? Okay, that's okay for me to continue. Chipping away at the impunity that makes it possible to mobilize for violence along ethnic lines. So one of the things that emerged out of the Kenyan truth process was that historically it had been possible for the political elite to mobilize their constituencies for violence, but primarily on a narrative that was not necessarily historically accurate. So I think, as Tabur has stated very well, providing a platform where it was possible to go around the country and get firsthand from those who are impacted by the conflict, their understandings of the drivers of the conflict, the people responsible, and their recommendations was extremely important because emerging out of that, it was possible to identify those who were behind the violence that had plagued the country around the election cycles. And whereas, it was not possible to get, justice as we understand it in the form of taking them through a legal system, the fact that that veil, the lies and the falsehoods that had made it possible to mobilize along ethnic lines that had been stripped away from them was extremely powerful in terms of the ability to get their constituencies behind them unquestioningly. And so, for instance, when one looks at the current elections, even 2017, a different dynamic where political actors could not take the support of their ethnic backgrounds, ethnic community backgrounds for granted. I think the other important thing that, when we are discussing around prevention is the protection that these processes avail to previously marginalized groups, whether it's on account of gender, so silent violations. If we look at the way these conflicts have been discussed in the past, a political context between dominant political groups, but when conversations are taken away and you are able to, as truth commissions were able to do, you take them down to the community level, it means that you give agency to those who are impacted by this conflict, and therefore bring to the fore their experiences, their expectations in terms of reparations and prevention. And so a classical case would be, for instance, SGBV and the deliberate steps that have now been taken by security agencies more permanent commissions such as the Human Rights Commission in ensuring that ahead of elections, for instance, measures are put in place to ensure that, for instance, women are not then easy targets for SGBB. And the last thing I would say, for instance, is that these spaces also, the truth process also expands the space for marginalized communities. So again, if you look at elections as a key trigger, so you're looking at the big communities, those who are able to marshal stories, marshal the numbers, and therefore the experiences of the smaller communities, their marginalization and exclusion from the economy of the country are often ignored. But the truth process, I think, underlining truth as a major outcome of these processes. So being able to interrogate what really is the truth of a country then is very instrumental in shaping the political space. And we could see that happen from something as, profound as restating the historical narrative of the independence struggle of Kenya, and really capturing that it was not just one community that secured the independence of the country and had then given it this sense of entitlement in terms of access to the resources of the country, but being able to demonstrate that the independence of the country was a collective effort. And therefore, giving the other communities the space within which to negotiate for increased access to the resources of the country. And ultimately, I feel these have been great contributors, especially to just taking away the potential, I think, for Kenya, the potential of being able to mobilize for violence along ethnic lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I think that statement you just made about truth being a major outcome ties together so much we've talked about, leading back to the first speaker, of whose truth is it? And if you are excluded from the truth, if your story is not part of that truth, how can you feel part of a future that is more peaceful? And so engaging marginalized communities as part of that truth seeking and developing that joint narrative, I think is a really powerful way that transitional justice brings a country together. So thank you very much. We have a number of questions now that are emerging from the audience. And I wonder if I can pose those to you, our panelists. We seem to have lost the connection for Ambassador Dr. Etsi Ngoga, but I hope that he will be able to come back on. But the first question, and I think we have time for all of you to give your own perspective here, is in regard to intergenerational trauma and its impact. How can practitioners work with youth who are trying to cope with both the trauma their parents have experienced, but also the trauma that they themselves experienced growing up in areas that experience conflict? So how can transitional justice processes better integrate a trauma-sensitive approach to interventions? Is there anyone who'd like to take that first?
If I may, thank you. So we had a very interesting engagement with a part of Kenya, in the northeastern part of Kenya. The Wagala massacre had occurred in 1984. And up till the time that we had these hearings, had not been publicly acknowledged. And what surprised us when we went there was that, as the question poses correctly, was the fact that not only the primary victims, but the generations that followed, this was their narrative, that They had experienced this gross violation. There was no acknowledgement. It appeared nowhere in our history books. What we took away from there was the power of truth commissions and providing the space for people to tell their story and not have it challenged. The feedback we got from the people who attended the hearings in the northeastern part of the country was that this was the first time they felt they were heard. And therefore, in response to that question, I just feel the power of the truth commissions, because unlike at least in our legal system where it's adversarial, and you have to meet certain thresholds in order for your evidence to be admissible. The fact that truth commissions allow and accommodate and facilitate for people to state their experiences. The feedback we got was that it was sufficient that that story had been heard and had been documented, found its way to the final report of the Truth Commission. What we were able to then do as a Truth Commission was have a monument in that particular region that then had the names of those who were killed or died from the torture at the Wagala airstrip. It was later, because of contested truths, I think, it was later mutilated and partially destroyed. But the community that was affected said to us that that acknowledgement and the platform that allows for telling that story. So I think going back to Madame Tabour's point around the power of storytelling, I think this was extremely important. The other thing we learned, of course, was that to embed within the Truth Commission professional counselors who then would be available to provide the support to those who came forward to tell their stories, because for many of them, it was close to reliving what had really been a traumatic experience. So not just going there as legal minds or who are listening to the story, but also professional counselors who are then able to provide on-site support and later on linking them to professional counselors within the community that would be able to provide longer term support. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In the interest of, oh yes, Madam Sar, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I'll just draw experience from what we have in the Gambia, because as I said, the dictatorship did not spare anybody, young, old, children, young people especially. And as my sister has said, in the Gambia, we have a youth and women and children's unit of the DRRC. It allows everyone to the opportunity to tell your story, and without being discriminated against. And I think with regards to the question, truth commissions will always come to an end. They're not there forever. They're just there to listen to the stories that people have gone through. But then from the truth commissions, there are always institutions that will follow, that will be there. And I think with all the units that are available as far as gender issues are concerned, it's important, organizations like ICTJ in countries that they operate, and other NGOs and civil society organizations to at least form and accommodate or give chance to these young people who have gone through a lot and are still traumatized. In the Gambia, we haven't gone into a genocide. We haven't gone into conflict per se, but we lived under dictatorship, and it is equally the same because your rights are seized. You cannot say anything, and also your rights are being trampled every other day. Women were sexually assaulted, and all these issues came out as a result of the Truth Commission. And I think most of these, especially mental health, if you go through certain trauma, it lives with you for the rest of your life. And I think with organizations dealing with truth commissions, coming out from truth commissions, or having providing these services, it's important to take note of young people as far as gender is concerned. So we have a holistic approach in rendering services to young people and children and those that were affected by the dictatorship.
Thank you very much. We only have about 4 minutes left, and I'd like to ask you something that perhaps seems a little bit unfair. But we do have a question that asks how we can overcome resistance from governments to address transitional justice and victims' rights. In our closeout, could I ask each of you in about 30 seconds to list one thing you think would be most helpful in overcoming government resistance? And I'll work in the order of my screen. And Cielo, I wonder if you would like to start.
No, but yes, of course. I think empowering the civil society and also the role of international organizations and the UN, the European the Union, the African Union, and in the case of Latin America, the Inter-American Inter-American Commission and Court.
Great, thank you. Ms. Nyondi, your one recommendation to overcome government resistance.
I would also go with civil society. They, I think, have the potential to unlock this because they are able to mobilize public voices to demand this. And I think the second point is what we've learned with the Kenyan experience is to move towards incremental implementation of the report. So to be able to break it down into small, progressive pieces for implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Madame Sarr, your one recommendation for overcoming government resistance.
I think one thing is to always ensure that the recommendations coming from truth commissions are implemented with adequate resources. And also the African Union have got the African Transitional Justice Policy Framework. And that is what we're using, but I think it has to also include power in their pillars, because it's power that is used to violate human rights, and it's a potential source of conflict if it is abused and exploited.
Thank you so much. Ibrahim, your one recommendation.
Yes, strengthen capacity of civil society and increase awareness and education on the part of the general public.
Good. Thank you. Mr. Van Ness.
Yeah, thanks. It's a difficult one from where I sit. I try to imagine why governments don't want to do it, and I think having a good dialogue with government is important, and basically try to make them understand that doing this is not a sign of weakness, it is a sign of strength, and not doing it will lead to more conflict, and any government should be interested in avoiding that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Ambassador Gatsuretsi Ngoga, you have the last word.
Thank you so much. I was listening in, and there's, you know, we keep talking about civil society, but there is one actor that we never talk about, actually two, who actually matter in our countries everywhere around the world. The first one is political parties. Political parties, because ultimately they're the ones who put forward these people who are going to be in government. So we need to mobilize political parties to understand the importance of what this means and to understand the importance of stability. The second group, which we often forget, is the business community. You cannot have a good environment for business if you do not have a functioning judicial system, and if you really do not put justice and reconciliation forward, because stability is key for a business environment. And believe me, many of these politicians, they would rather listen to a businessman than listen to someone from the civil society organization. It's a reality. It's not that I'm for it or not, but it's a reality, because follow the money. That's what it is. So I think that these two constituencies, the political parties and the business community, are often neglected in moving our countries forward. And we need to make them also equally responsible, because without them, these politicians cannot function as well. Thank you so much, and thanks for having us.
Thank you all so much. This has been such a rich and insightful and wonderful program. And I wish we had many, many more hours together. I hope we will in the future. So thank you all. And it's my pleasure now to turn the floor over to Fernando.
Thank you very much, Melanie, and thank you all the speakers and contributors. We do take the commitment to get more time for continuing the discussion and the conversations that we have had here today. As I said at the beginning, this is just the first launching of the reports, but we really want to organize different forums and platforms virtually until we have the luxury to resume in-person meetings, but to continue the conversations with all of you. I really want to thank everybody for the contributions that they have done, very interesting insights and reflections. I appreciate the mention of different stakeholders that might not be here, but we are working hard to integrate in the conversation, like political parties, business community, that we as ICTJ, we work hard in the countries where we work to engage them in this conversation as well. And also what Melanie said at the beginning, that examining transitional justice through the prevention lens doesn't necessarily require rethinking the understanding of transitional justice, but breaking the silos and bringing together and bridging with other policy goals that are absolutely interconnected. And I appreciate the interventions that everyone did on this regard. We are really out of time, and I apologize because there are other questions in the chat that we didn't have the time to respond, but we take them to the next occasions. I really want to thank all the speakers for your contributions and for your collaboration with us in this event and for your work in the different affiliations that you have. I also want to thank everyone at ICTJ who have worked very, very hard in this research project throughout the years. Of course, the researchers and everyone who has been collaborating also to put this event together. And I, of course, want to thank the government of Luxembourg for their long-term support and partnership that we appreciate very much. And saying that, I want to give the floor to Ambassador Christian Brown. He is the permanent representative of Luxembourg to the United Nations here in New York. And I would like him to invite to close in the event. Ambassador.
Thank you very much, Fernando. Dear colleagues and friends, I'm happy to have been here with you today, albeit virtually, for this important event. Thank you for the many stimulating and thought-provoking insights over the last hour. It has been extremely interesting to listen to real experts from the ground about the relevance of transitional justice for peace and stability. And I've been also very interested to hear how concepts come together, how they get married, transitional justice, truth commissions, human rights, rule of law also, because it's sometimes also something articulating rule of law and transitional justice. I mean, these things have been also mentioned in some cases. It is a little bit the same issues, I must say, that I discussed with your predecessor 5 years ago. And the same questions are still there, and I think that we will probably stay there for a long time. But it is very important that this articulation between concepts, how to do, is also examined, and that we hear the voice of the ground there in order to see if we are right. I'm very proud of Luxembourg's support for this important research project on the contribution of transitional justice to preventing human rights violation, violence, repression, and violent conflict. I cannot think of a better partner than ICTJ to have carried out this research. There's no government resistance from our part here. I'm convinced that the results of presented today will not only shape the work on the ground, but will also help to articulate the added value of transitional justice in global policy discussion and contribute to global efforts to prevent further injustice. In that regard, I would reiterate what Minister Fayot underlined in his opening statement. You can count on Luxembourg's continued support to advance this important agenda worldwide. We look forward to see how the result of this project will influence global policy, and we are hopeful that it will influence it deeply. Thank you very much once more for giving me the occasion to speak and for giving us both the occasion to hold this meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your nice words and for your commitment and support. And thank you, everybody who has been watching in the last 1 hour and a half from here, the United States or American continent in Europe. Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon. Wishing you a nice rest of the day on the evening, and we'll stay in touch to continue our conversations. Thank you very much for the participation. Thank you, and we'll stay in touch. Bye.
Bye.